basically, I just want to make sure this video doesn't run ahead. I live in a small country called Andorra. Oops, spoiler ahead. And a lot of people wouldn't have heard about it. It's situated in the Pyrenees Alps between Spain and France. And this is typically what it looks like. This is Lake Juclar. And there's a lot of, as Marcel said, a lot of outdoor stuff to do here. A lot of skiing in the winter, a lot of hiking, climbing in summer. And we run our company from here, and we do business across mostly Europe and a little bits of Africa as well. Right, I'm not going to say much more about myself. So what I really want to talk about today is what's called DocuOps. And the talk itself is not going to be that technical, but I am definitely want to look into what is basically a thing that's a lot of times is just simply ignored and is considered the stepchild or the little red-haired child in engineering. At this point, I'm just going to turn off the video to make sure we don't have any issues with lag. Right. Generally, there's always tend to be a problem with documentation. It is something that's not done in the right place. It tends to be ignored. It can cause a lot of delays in getting delivery out, and sometimes the documentation quality does not do the product quality any justice. So what we're looking at is a process of actually simplifying the whole process of documentation and making part of effectively automation and the whole DevOps process. And by doing this, we really look at considering documentation as being an engineering problem. And what we mean by that is that in terms of software development, we have solved a lot of problems. In the old days, we had a lot of manual processes. Now we have a lot of automated processes. We have looked at ways, we have struggled with doing certain things, and we made some ways and made some tools as well to make our lives easier. And in the same process, we actually want to do the same with documentation. So for instance, in software development, we already have revision control. That gives us a very easy way of reverting software and seeing the changes. There's no reason that we can't do that in documentation. I mean, people are used to sort of kind of tools that might give you some kind of revision control already. And if you use the software development, you know, there are some very excellent tools for doing that. We also have the whole process of publishing documentation, which is nothing different to really publishing software. Software goes about, we want to build, we want to test software, and then we effectively want to deploy that. So in software, we want to start from the point where we want to say, I want to go from commit to deployment without any interaction. Now, not all companies do that, but we know some companies do, and they're very good at that. The point is really that we have solved that problem in software development. And the question is whether we can solve this with documentation as well. In the past, we have always have the case of having to test software. You used to do it manually. And the verification of software is about whether it runs basically without problems and whether we have actually built the correct product. We don't have any differences really with documentation as well, because really we are looking at two things. The one is we want to make sure the structure of how we present documents to the user, whether it be developers or end users, is correct, and whether the content is actually also correct and readable. And if you speak to many tech writers, you will find that the problem is generally is that they either work in isolation from people doing software development, and the information is always an afterthought. Like we solved the problem in testing of effectively what's called left shifting, of moving tests as early as possible, designing test specs right at the beginning and bring it into the development process. We want to do the same thing with documentation. And in reality, we want to take engineering tools and solve our problems. And as with software development, we want to go from writing to publication in a near zero effort. And this doesn't mean there's zero effort in writing documents. It just means it's the same as software. There's effort in writing it, but the physical publication of the software should be zero effort. And although we tend to focus a lot on automation, in DevOps, there's obviously different aspects of it. You'll probably find that this talk really is going to spend more time on automation, but it does not ignore all of the other cases, because if we develop proper documentation, it means we actually have to still have a full team integrated to be able to share the knowledge as quickly as possible. And we want people to be able to write write documentation, even if they're not good at it, because we will have people in our team that's actually good at like proper tech writers and people who can do copy edits, who can actually polish the product. It's the same kind of thing that we have in software development, where we talk with different kind of skills. Some people have better testing skills and some people have better development skills, but these people can actually cross-pollinate their skills, and if they work together, they deliver a better product. And the other thing we really want to do is to actually reduce the manual proofreading. It is required that we always do proofreading in the same way that we do code reviews. And although different people will have different views on code reviews, we generally find that still a manual review has to be part of it. And anybody that's currently works with something like, especially GitHub, GitLab, or for instance, Bitbucket, understands that there's a process by which you can actually optimize your code reviews, in that you make a pull request that can get reviewed, and once somebody is happy with it, they just click a button, it gets merged, and you can actually then optimize the process of from that merge to have automatic deployment. The same thing, you can actually integrate your documentation into the build, so that if the documentation is reviewed as part of the same pull request, you could actually have your documentation pulled at the same time. A problem that's really existed for many years, long before we even had the concept of DevOps, is the question of dev-doc distance. And what this means is, the further you remove your documentation from the development, the worse it's going to get. The classic old way was that people write documents in, for instance, Microsoft Word or in Confluence, and they write code in whatever language they want, and they store it in source control. This means that there's a very good chance that somebody will commit something and the documentation doesn't get updated. So part of DocuOps is actually to reduce this distance as closely as possible. And there was a book that was written years ago called Agile Documentation. It was written, I think, about 2003, 2002, I can't exactly remember. It was when the Agile movement really took off, and there was a lot of books coming out about Agile, and this one specific book basically stood out about Agile documentation. And in that book, the author actually, whose name I now forgot, fortunately, addressed a lot of the concern of actually bringing the two parts as close to each other. And he started by looking at documentation inside code, for instance, API documentation, and actually looking at user guides and everything around it, and see how much you can bring it as close as possible. So in order to solve this problem and actually make a full deployment of documentation as part of the standard software process, we want to reduce that distance. And we'll look at that in a moment, but just have a moment and look at what we actually want to do in terms of the pipeline. Because the other problem in documentation is not just write once and it's part of that like software. A lot of documentation also requires translation. For instance, website translation and user guide translation as well. About 15, 16 years ago, I was working on a product, and we actually integrated this kind of process already into it. Engineers were writing all of the strings, all of the basic user guide information, and the help screens. And this was reviewed by tech writers, was all put in source control. And then they had a process that extracted all of this and pushed it off to the translation teams. Once they got the translations back, it automatically got fed back into the build. And it was basically a case of then committing it to source control. And when the build ran, automatically picked up all of the translations. There are a couple of tools that can help in this environment. I'm not actually going to look at it, but the one thing to consider in this context is that if you have a product that requires translation, you cannot ignore the translation that uses an afterthought. Because if you want to be as effective as possible, you want to bring it in as closely as possible. Obviously, we know with translations there is delay because it's just not going to happen. It has to go to translation teams. So this is something that has to be factored in into the process. We don't always want to say, and this is sometimes the misconception, is that a translation or that a DevOps pipeline has to be as fast as possible. It's not necessarily as fast, but it has to be as effective as possible. And if we build this into the workflow, we can understand where the bottlenecks is, and we can actually build a pipeline to optimize around these bottlenecks. The one thing that we recommend for anybody that gets into DocuOps is that your tech writers has to learn source control, and preferably Git. And the reason for this is simply that Git is the most widely used source control system today. There are multiple platforms like GitHub, GitLab, etc. that works on top of it. And you don't necessarily have to know the command line to get to Git. A lot of people can simply work through a web UI and still do a lot. It's totally possible, for instance, for someone to create a repository on GitHub and get people to edit directly on the GitHub website and make their commits there and have access to, for instance, the version control. And there's still other tools that can extract it afterwards and build. But it's good to know the basics, and that is things like to know about how to extract diffs, how to review the changes, and understand the basic process around Git. And if there's one tool that they should really learn, it's just that. It's not, I wouldn't say even look at anything else unless the company that's involved uses a different tool. This is a basic skill I think that we can actually teach tech writers today. And another thing we really want to look at is to focus on content, not formatting. A common problem that happens in a lot of writing is that somebody, for instance, would write in a word processing tool, and soon the problem is that they get caught up in the formatting. Everybody knows that they've worked with Word, and then for some reason that bullet points they don't want to line up anymore because somewhere you've clicked something and things are going skew. And you spend a couple of hours to try to fix that, and instead of actually focusing on the content. There are two reasons for you also to focus on the content. The one is not, as I mentioned, the formatting, but the second point is it allows you to work on a problem-solving context. And you can actually then take the content and give it to somebody else to review, and they can actually focus on the content and perform a copy edit for you instead of having to try and fix your formatting. So we solve one problem by actually focusing on the content and not the formatting. So in order to solve the problem, we actually need tools to be able to do this for us. And before I get to the tools, the other point really was that if you can focus on content, you can actually also focus on writing once and then publish to multiple formats. Typical formats today are web documents or PDFs. There could be other formats as well, but this would typically be the first two. I mean, there are also things like EPUB documents, etc., or DocBook, which can be exported to different formats, but generally the first two formats to focus generally on is to publish to the web or to PDF. And you don't want to do this as two documents. Anybody knows that you can't really write to HTML straight and then try to write to PDF. It will look ugly, it won't look nice. So by focusing on content and then writing once for the content, you can actually publish into multiple formats, and you can use your automation pipeline to do this for you. And in this case, we really want to start looking at text-based markup the same way we've done with source code. I remember back in the 90s, people were talking about case tools are going to rule the world. We will never have to write code again. I've actually heard it in 2000s, and you've heard it later again. The fact is, source code are still being written in text mostly, and there's good reasons for that. There's just the way we're thinking. It reduces any issues that could be taking our mind off it and allows us to focus. And it's easy to review. Source control tools are built around it. That means it's easy to do a diff. It's easy to do fancy diffs on it. It's easy to roll back and make changes. If you did a big edit and you're not happy with the edit, you can easily throw it away by going back. And today, there are some good markup languages you can use. For instance, there's a lot of different flavors of Markdown, which is probably the simplest form of markup language you can use. And from Markdown, you can go to various formats, including web pages, PDFs, and a couple of others. There's also restructured text, which are popular with a couple of communities in the tech world, and they are really good. Product documentation and API documentations are being generated out of restructured text today. The third format is the ASCII doc format. It's becoming exceedingly popular. You can write in GitHub and GitLab today. You can actually write documents directly in ASCII doc, and it will get rendered into a formatted form directly on the website. And you can, from ASCII doc, you can go to many different formats as well. And it is probably one of the best supported tools. It's got some very good tool chains behind it, which can actually be very easily integrated into an automated pipeline. And the most important thing about the whole documents process is not just restricted to technical documents. We can easily fall into this trap. But there are a lot of other documents that can generate it in the same way by using text markup and going to final documents. For instance, a very good example is legal documents. You can structure legal documents. You can easily now review the changes. And then you can have a process after commit, which actually generates the legal document. In our company, that's actually the way we do it as well. All of our contracts that we issue with our subcontractors, etc., are done in this way. Everything is effectively in revision control, and the only thing that we really store afterwards is a generated PDF document, which is electronically signed, and for legal purposes, the only thing we'll keep separately. But anything else that we keep is in revision control, and we can quickly switch between different versions. We can see exactly which versions of the legal documents we use at some stage. And we can actually regenerate that same legal document if we need to. We can go back in time, which is another great reason for doing it this way. Okay. And another example is something we've used for generating training materials. For instance, you can actually have all of the documents stored in source. You can have different formats that feed us, and then once the documents every time gets pushed to the revision control, we have a process that builds it, and it creates different formats. It creates a guide that gets handed out to attendees. It automatically generates the slides that gets used by the presenter. It can generate a brochure at the same time to market the course, and we can generate a couple of other things as well if we want. We can even push some of the data to a website which contains metadata about the process, and the website documentation gets generated from that. Effectively, the whole process just simply works by once you've reviewed it in, for instance, GitLab, and you decide you're happy and you merge it, the process kicks off and it does the rest. There's effectively zero effort afterwards.
Schalk, you have a couple more minutes left, but again, since there's no speaker after this, it's okay if you take a few more minutes.
Thank you. I am nearly done. Right, just to give you an overview, some handy tools you can get into if you already don't know about them, especially the source control. Typically, as I said, the core tool to take is Git, but you can use GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, and a couple of other ones on top of that. You need some kind of pipeline, and that depends on the organization, and typically a tool like Jenkins or GitLab, and other tools as well. Travis I've mentioned on there, although I am not sure what's happening to Travis nowadays since they have changed management. But there are a couple of good tools in this space into which you can actually integrate your DocuOps pipeline. You need some build tools as well, just to integrate everything. Two great tools are, for instance, Gradle and Rake. And some of them have very good integration with some of the documentation tools. And then you need some converters. For instance, ASCII Doctor will do conversions of ASCII Doc, and Sphinx does very good conversions of restructured text. Pandoc is a very, very useful tool to have around because it can be placed in intermediate to do conversions to some strange formats that you would normally not be able to convert between each other. And then you just need, what's great as well, just need a text editor. And you can use some fancy IDE, you can use a simple text editor for doing text-based markup. So it means that the cost of integration is a lot cheaper and it's easier to learn. Some of these tools have really great plugins now, for instance, Atom and IntelliJ. Because I work with ASCII Doc a lot, I've seen how the plugins for these two editors have actually progressed, and it's just getting better and better. So it's also getting easier and easier for tech writers to use these tools, and it's easier to wean them off the tools that they used to, like Microsoft Word. And I just want to get back to something. Patrick Lee mentioned something this morning, and usually in DevOps they talk about two things. It's either CAMF or CAMS. So I remember he used CAMS this morning. I'm just going to talk about CAMF, which is really actually the same thing. All of this is great, but it won't work if you don't have the culture to build DocuOps in. So it is also a learning process to just change the way you work. Automation is obviously something that generally just comes naturally because that's the first thing we always think about. Obviously, as metrics, you'll have to look at how many things fail. You can look at different kind of ways of measuring how well your process works. And then there's feedback and sharing. You want to know if there's issues, if things break. For instance, there's processes where we want to create code snippets as examples in user documentation. And our old problem that always happens is that those snippets get out of date. Now we have a process where people can actually write real code, they actually write real tests, and the documentation picks up snippets from the real tests and put it in the documentation. So the code is never out of date that's in the documentation. And if the test fails, the documentation won't get generated. So we don't have anything that's out of sync. So that's the kind of feedback we are also looking for. And just to top it off, so obviously I've talked a lot about this, but this presentation itself was built in exactly the same way. We just use the text editor, we build a presentation, and we just use the tool to create it to a format that we wanted. So in order to prepare for this, I didn't have to focus on what I wanted, the formatting of the presentation. I focused on the content, and the tool did the rest for me. And that is me for today. And I think if you want to contact me, that's my email address, and you can engage with me on Twitter as well. That's my Twitter handle. And if you're interested in DocuOps, you can also follow the DocuOps Twitter handle. And that's it. Thank you very much, Masa and Bill.
All right, excellent, very good. I like that basically, you are eating the food that you're selling, by having created the presentation this way. So that's pretty cool. Anyway, so I think we have some questions, Bill. You collected some.
Yeah, I'm just sitting in here. First of all, this is a great presentation. Thank you very much. And great solution here to complete the workflow. Two questions, and I'll run into one. First of all, and most importantly, how do we learn more about DocuOps?
So let me get, the question was, how do we learn more about DocuOps?
Yes.
Okay, so the basic thing is obviously learn by practice.
Okay.
The more you do it, the easier it will get, but basically is follow some of these guidelines. Go look up some of the text markup tools and start writing some of your docs at that and use a tool that can convert it. Once you've learned a bit about how that works, your automation guys would probably be the people that would understand better how to integrate it into the full process. That's on the automation side. Then on the culture side, it's just a way of also basically, like you would do with any other agile process, what we did in the past, or Kanban process, is continual reinforcement, where you keep on telling yourself, we have to do this, we do this, and you practice as a group and you support each other. Then it gets easier.
Absolutely. Okay, very good. Then another question here, which is kind of giggle a little bit on it, and how is this compatible with the agile value of working software over comprehensive documentation?
I like
giggle too.
People ask it. We never said that, oh, when it says comprehensive documentation, we also have to remember where that came from. It came from the old days when people were forced to write a lot of documentation which nobody read.
Correct.
It's always about principle is do just enough and not anything more. You will know if you produce some software which has no documentation on it, it's going to be hard for people to use. Obviously, you might say, well, I'm generating an app and the app is so easy to use, then maybe yes, for the end user, you don't need it. But a lot of tools don't work that way. And obviously, if you focus on developers, they do get upset if they can't at least have some basic documentation just to get started. So there's always like that effective point that you have to get to. You know, you have to write something. We generate a lot of software and we do write a lot of documentation. You always find people read it and it's not always at the right point. So you always have to make changes.
Right. And especially, and you mentioned this to build on what you said, there's several agencies that depending on being their customer, they require documentation for audits and certifications. So that has to be produced and you're doing that, so that's great. I think that pretty much covers all the questions. Do you have any personal questions, Masa, you may want to ask?
You know, way back in the day when I used to do development, Java Docs was like the hot thing to use. So what's the advantage over something like the Java Docs?
It's not actually an advantage. They are complementary. And your DocuOps project still generates something like Java Docs. And because that's actually straight down very technical API documentation. Now, there's two interesting things here. Java Doc you can actually integrate with ASCII Doc because there's an integration. So your Java Doc actually becomes a bit simpler to write. But that's beside the point. What we actually do with some of this open source software we produce is it generates user documentation and the Java Doc API documentation at the same time. And the two is linked to some way that you can actually have links from the user guides back into the API docs. And you can use, for instance, a link checker tool as part of your build process to make sure that the links that you put into your user docs actually point back to the Java doc that gets generated. So you actually end up with a full bundle of hopefully useful documentation. So they're not replacing each other. And you actually see it with other languages as well, which have built-in documentation tools. You can do exactly the same thing.